At first, the Latin word evolutio meant the unrolling of a scroll. This gives the flavor of the inevitable recitation of a story or message. The story has already been composed. All that is needed is to read out the message in a consistent fashion, from beginning to end. However, there obviously isn't a beginning and an end. In this podcast, we'll discuss all aspects of evolution and more. Hi everyone, my name is Vaishali. The purpose of this first episode is to educate you about the stories, history, and the vast amount of thoughts about evolution. We'll discuss everyone from Anaximander to Charles Darwin and their thoughts about how humankind came to be. To put it simply, in biology, evolution is the idea that all species on Earth evolve from other pre-existing organisms, and their characteristics change over several generations. People from all over the world tell tales of how the world began. All current people who live in traditional societies, such as hunter-gatherer tribes, nations or chiefdoms, or state-level societies, adhere to a specific set of origin-related concepts. Any ideas that fall outside the realm of science, however, are considered creation myths, and are usually in aspects of a culture's religion. Creation myths are mystical, cultural, or spiritual stories that explain the roots of humanity, Earth, nature, and the universe. One of the reasons why creation stories are so universal is that all cultures have the same basic questions about life, such as where did the universe and the Earth come from, and why do we humans exist? Because it's human nature to ponder the unknown and search for answers. All the creation stories we know today stem from these very questions. For example, Genesis, the creation myth of both Judaism and Christianity, contains two origin stories, both of which are accepted as the creation of the world by the beliefs of modern Judaism, Christianity, and Islam faiths. In the first, God says, "Let there be light," and light appears. In 6 days, God creates the sky, heaven, land, plants, the sun, moon, stars, animals, and humans. On the first and second days, God created the sky, light, and heavens. On the third day, the soil and vegetation. On the fourth day, the sun, moon, and stars. On the fifth, the aquatic and avian creatures. Finally, on the sixth, land-based wildlife and humankind. He created the fish in the seas, birds in the air, and all kinds of flora and fauna on the land. God had gifted these creatures with the gills to breathe, wings to fly, and eyes to see, etc. To all he says, "Be fruitful and multiply," which they do, all the handiwork of an omniscient God. On the seventh day, God rests and ponders his handiwork. The second story is of the well-known Adam and Eve. Some of these legends have found their place in history and long eclipsed the civilizations that first gave them a voice. Some of us hold to the ethics and morals that were first illustrated in the folklore and epics of people who died centuries before us, who spoke languages we will never understand, experienced things we will never experience, and who lived in lands we will never touch. The passage of time, the concept of birth, and the vision of an all-knowing creator are among the common threads across creation stories, despite the fact that some are quite unusual. So what if creation stories of contrary cultures share similar aspects? In particular, a theme of many fables in numerous cultures, including those of Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, presents primeval water as the lone element that existed in the beginning. Many philosophers have developed their ideas based on this recurring theme, that the fabric of the universe was built from primeval water. The key, or mist, which represents the divine power that embodies the cosmic force governing matter, time, and space, is one exception to this rule. It was the first core element in Chinese cosmology. According to Chinese historical texts, this energy changes at the moment of creation, breaking into dual aspects of male and female, yin and yang, hard and soft matter, and other binary components, which leads to the Chinese origin story. Several legends begin with the cracking of a cosmic egg, including the Chinese one. A primordial cosmic egg floated within the infinite void containing chaos, a mixture of forces of yin and yang. Over time, the interplay between multiple elements and energies eventually conceived a primal being, a shaggy horned giant named Pangu. Pangu slept and matured for 18,000 years. One day, he mysteriously awoke. When he opened his eyes, all he could see was the heavy veil of darkness. He strained his ears, but all he could hear was the unnerving silence. He was deeply disturbed by his somber environment. After eons of incubation, Pangu grew agitated and conjured a magical axe, swung it down, and gave the egg a mighty chop. The egg split into two with a thunderous crack. He separated chaos into many opposites, including the earth and the sky. He set the sun, moon, stars, and planets into place, divided the seas, and chiseled valleys and mountains. The denser piece, yin, of the egg drifted downwards, forming the earth. The lighter piece, yang, rose to form the sky. Pangu feared the parts might reform, so he stood in the center, his head in the clouds and his feet firmly planted in the soil. He stretched together with the earth and heavens as they both rose by 10 feet every day. He grew 10 feet per day for another 18,000 years. The sky was higher and the earth was thicker. Pangu loomed between them like a pillar 30,000 miles in height, so they would never again connect. When Pangu died, his parts transformed into facets of the universe. His skull became the crest of the sky. His voice became the rolling thunder. His breath, the breeze and clouds. His right eye glowed into the moon, while his left eye blazed into the sun. His flesh and limbs turned into 5 huge mountains, and his blood formed rivers. His muscles turned into lush meadows, and his veins became roads. The innumerable stars in the sky popped out of his hair and beard, and the trees and flowers sprouted from his skin. His teeth and nails hardened into precious metals. His bone marrow turned into jade and pearls. His sweat flowed like a sweet dew and gentle shower that balanced all life on earth. Some say that the parasite that plagued his body became an ancestor of mankind. Others say that when the goddess Nua felt isolated, she fashioned men from a yellow river clay and sculpted them into human figures in a similar way to how a ceramic craftsman would make a sculpture. After creating these creatures for a while, Nua ran out of energy and realized that if she created each by hand, she wouldn't be able to inhabit the planet. So she took the rope, pulled it out of the mud, and lifted it. She threw it in all directions, and all the drops that hit the ground split into several humans. The people sculpted by Nua became the wealthiest and most influential people of the world, and the people she rushed into making became the sick and poor. There are countless legends that reflect this one as creation stories, some more well-known and some less. No matter how widely accepted a creation story is, it always attempts to answer the same questions. Where did we and everything we see come from, and why? One of the things we can trust to answer this question is the idea of evolution. In order to bring clarity and context to our story, it is important to understand all the philosophies and beliefs that precede the modern theory of evolution. We've built our society, advanced in technology, and our ability to observe and adapt many theories through simple research. Consider this podcast a snapshot of evolutionary philosophy, highlighting some of the most notable evolutionary thoughts, from ancient times to the Age of Enlightenment to the present. The beginning of evolutionary thought can be traced back to Anaximander, an ancient Greek philosopher who lived from 610 BC to 546 BC. He believed that life began in the waters, and that evolution flowed from there. He also concluded that man evolved from another creature, such as fish, and evolved into another creature similar to fish. Human infants cannot survive without long-term care, while certain animals can survive on their own right after birth. Anaximander speculated that humankind's ancestors were sea creatures who migrated to dry land. Anaximander wasn't the only ancient Greek philosopher investigating the origins of humans. Empedocles, who lived from 490 BC to 430 BC, held that dismembered organs born out of the earth came together to design bizarre creatures. He imagined arms without shoulders, cattle with human heads, and many more terrifying creatures. He could have been influenced by previous tales of Greek mythical creatures, like centaurs, gorgons, sphinxes, and chimeras, that appeared to be stitched together out of multiple animal pieces. However, because of the Church's influence, evolutionary ideas were thereafter prevented from spreading, and posing a threat to the doctrine of special creation for roughly 15 centuries. So that explains the significant jump in the timeline we're about to experience. Now we've come to the Age of Enlightenment, aka the 18th century. In the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment was a cultural movement that revolutionized European philosophy, research, and ethos. The quest for truth and knowledge, and the emphasis on logic and reason rather than mysticism and superstition, was central to the Enlightenment, which challenged traditional beliefs and pursued modernity. Despite the fact that the sense of progress and development was the core of the 18th century Enlightenment, it did not lead to a significant theory of evolution. When Georges-Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon, a French naturalist, published his Natural History of Animals, a 44-volume encyclopedia of all known facts of the natural world, He made another major step towards modern evolutionary theory. He first proposed the possibility that all animals were descended or evolved from a common ancestor or prototype living in the land of origin, which was described as the perfect place for them, a place he imagined to be Europe. Buffon described the similarities found in the bones of very different animals. For example, he noticed that a dog's leg had bones similar to those found in seal fins, even though the two structures were used in very different ways. Being expelled from their ancestral homes will lead to improper climate and/or degeneration from perfect prototypes, though he didn't believe in mutations. According to Buffon, degeneration was the most widespread and extreme of the creatures farthest from their ancestral homes. Over time, the animals gradually moved away from the key prototype by degrees. In essence, it's a de-evolutionary thought. The notion that evolution is directional and that species can eventually return to a seemingly simple form is called de-evolution or backward evolution. One might use examples of de-evolution using birds as a reference. The evolutionary innovation that granted modern birds the upper hand over dinosaurs was their far shorter incubation periods, but it came at the sacrifice of their teeth. Due to the complexity of evolution, there are often a myriad of overlapping arguments for why specific traits are adaptive. The source of the bird's beak, not the teeth, is one such unsolved mystery. Theropod dinosaurs, including some of these ferocious carnivorous creatures with jaws full of jagged teeth, such as the Velociraptor and Tyrannosaurus rex, are the ancestors of modern birds. They evolved from extinct creatures like the Archaeopteryx, the link between dinosaurs and birds. Thankfully, even the most vicious birds of prey of today lack teeth, yet experts are unsure of why birds lost their dental care. As per one explanation, teeth ultimately gave way to beaks in order to minimize weight for flight. However, a 2014 research study published in Science counters this hypothesis by showing that tooth loss and nascent beak formation happened about the same time. DNA from the crypt is a powerful tool for unlocking the secrets of evolutionary history. Mark Springer, a professor of biology at the University of California, Riverside, and one of the study's lead researchers, said in a statement, "Following the cataclysmic extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago, ecological adaptations, including the evolution of beaks, are considered to have spurred the explosive diversity of birds. Speaking of birds, penguins can also serve as a model of alleged de-evolution. The issue is that categorizing such as de-evolution assumes falsely that flying is an endpoint that evolution is working towards. Flight was convenient and permitted ancestral penguins to enhance their reproductive performance. Thus, it was selected. After the large dinosaurs were extinct, penguin ancestors quickly lost their capacity to fly. With fossils dating to around 60 million years ago, the oldest known penguin was already a flightless swimmer with thin wings. Modern penguins still have feathers, wing bones, and a jutting breastbone for wing muscle attachments, which are identifiable hallmarks of their avian ancestry. However, flying was not favorable to penguins, and it was beneficial to be plump. Therefore, selection operated against aviation, and adaptations for surviving in frigid climates emerged. Penguins naturally adapted to their new climate, not de-evolving as a result. Flight was no longer an advantage, so they evolved accordingly." Back to Buffon. He suggested organic change, that creatures manifest from organic compounds by spontaneous generation. For context, spontaneous generation is the supposed method by which life spontaneously arises from inanimate matter. For example, rations of cheese and bread wrapped in rags and left in a hidden corner were thought to generate mice, because mice were eventually discovered inside the cloth, even though this was because it was an ideal food source for the mice. Worms were also suspected to emerge from the combinations of soil and water, while maggots happened to come from rotting meat. This was later proven false. He suggested the potential for productive hybrids of organic molecules as there are flora and fauna, despite the fact that he didn't provide a unified framework for these changes. Regarding evolution, various philosophers and scientists from the Age of Enlightenment, famously Erasmus Darwin, an 18th century English physician, proposed different aspects of what would eventually become evolution. His philosophy is found in Zoonomia, his 2-volume medical textbook which aims to establish laws that explain the mysterious classifications, sexual selection, organic life, competition, etc. that surround animals. It was a text studded with thoughts on natural history, human life, and origins. His thoughts on the diversity of life and evolution are also published in The Loves of Plants. Erasmus Darwin wasn't as famous as his grandson Charles Darwin, although he laid much of the groundwork for evolutionary principles in poetry through his ambitious work Zoonomia, where he wrote, "Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of years, that all the warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament?" He discusses ideas that his grandson elaborates on years later, the idea of common descent from one living filament, or one ancestor as he previously wrote, taking the reader on a journey through the evolution of mankind, through millennia, through heroic couplets and vivid imagery. This was the experience of Darwin's final poem, The Temple of Nature, an epic about the history of the universe. To quote an extract from his poem, "Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms the minute, unseen by the spheric glass, move on mud or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring in breathing realms of fin, feet, and wing." Another innovative 18th century thinker was Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist who designed the hierarchical structure of plant and animal taxonomy that's still used today. He's often called the father of taxonomy. He had a deep passion for nature and an admiration for the natural world. To sum up his inner motivation for system design, natural science would reveal the divine order of God's creation, and the naturalist's goal would be to build a natural classification to indicate this order in the universe. Thus, his impulses were primarily religious, which led him to natural theology. Linnaeus had strong religious convictions, as he grew up in a household that valued religion and nature. He believed that since God made the world, one could learn about God's wisdom by looking at the world he had created. Like Buffon, Erasmus Darwin, and Carolus Linnaeus, there are many scholars and philosophers who decorate the history of evolutionary thought, but French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed the first theory of evolution in the early 19th century. Lamarckism is the concept that an organism could transfer physical features developed during its lifetime to its offspring. The traits acquired during the life of an organism, or acquired traits, are at the heart of Lamarckism. Organs that are frequently used by living things continue to develop, but rarely used qualities will be lost in future generations. But how do you get those acquired traits? Lamarck's most famous example of this was the giraffe. Picture ancestral giraffes. These creatures roughly mimic contemporary giraffes, but lack their signature lengthy necks, which stretch to about half the length they are now. According to Lamarckism, the necks of ancient giraffes lengthened over time because they stretched for the tree leaves. As a result, the next generation of giraffes were born with elongated necks that stretched even further. Lamarck also proposed, like in the giraffe example, that a blacksmith builds muscle in his arms and passes it down to his kids. He argued that evolution was a constant process of enhancing intricacy and perfection. In summary, he argued that these changes were induced by changes in behavior and environment, which resulted in the shift in the use and disuse of target organs. His idea was mocked and ridiculed at the time, and it did not hold up in light of contemporary knowledge. However, Lamarck did contribute to putting thoughts of evolution on the map and stimulating future research. Anyways, we've come to a conclusion in our first episode. In part 2 of this episode, we'll explain the modern theory of evolution, its origins, and delve deeper into the science behind it. Make sure to follow the podcast and tune in for the next episode. Thank you for listening.